everybody. Do we need the mic? Is that too loud, or do you want me to go this way? Or this way? That way? Okay, because Susan says that I have a tendency to yell at my audience. So please don't be offended, because I'm very passionate about my subject and I get into it. So I'm not yelling at you. Well, I might be yelling at you, but no one else, okay? All right, because you deserve it. All right. So my name is Al Salopek. I'm the president of the Palm Beach County Beekeepers Association for 2 years, and I was the vice president for 1 year. Hello, tells you something about me, not much upstairs. But I started a nonprofit organization called Bee Understanding, because way back when, about 6 years ago, when everybody went broke in the world, right along with me, instead of jumping off a bridge, I decided to do good in the world. And so I started a nonprofit organization to teach children about the importance of the honeybee, because I found that I was ignorant to the fact of why honeybees were having problems in the first place. And so once I started learning the answers that I didn't know, I found out that beekeepers aren't a very organized group, at least in the sense of being organized to lobby for things or get information out to the public, because they were tending to bees from 12 o'clock at night until 7 or 8 o'clock the next night. And the last thing they wanted to do was get involved with politics. They just wanted to be their own person, mess around with their women, as in bees, because most of the bees are women in the hive. And so I said, well, I won't be a commercial beekeeper. I will be the guy that's the voice that needs to be filled. And so that's how I got started. I was always in the restaurant business, from 19 to really old, 7 different restaurants, and then I retired. So here I am today, 6 years later, the president of the Palm Beach County Beekeepers Association, the director of Bee Understanding, and a board member at the Florida State Beekeepers Association, which brings me to, some people were asking me, what's your shirt say? It says, to be or not to be is not an option. Become a beekeeper. Okay? But also on the t-shirt it says the Florida State Honeybee Conference. The Florida State Beekeepers Association has been around for 94 years, and this is the first year that the Honeybee and Beekeepers Conference has come to Palm Beach County. The Palm Beach County Beekeepers Association is hosting it at the Embassy Suites Hotel, and we would love to see anybody there that wants to learn in depth about the honeybee. Now, you don't have to know anything about the honeybee. You just have to have that desire to learn, because we will have 22 speakers from across the country, and this is one of the first times that all of these minds have spoken in the same place. You get most of the conferences will choose 2 or 3 of the speakers, and not all 22. So it should be an exciting 3-day event. We have cards in the back, or you can go to our website, beekeepingconference.com, and learn all about it. It's the first weekend in October, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, a 3-day event. You can come to 1 day, 2 days, or 3 days. So I'd love to see some of you there.
I'm speaking on day 3.
And Susan Lerner, your past president, is speaking on Saturday at the conference about native plants and the honeybee. So that should be a great talk. We've actually heard some of it at our meetings at Pine Jog the first Friday of every month, and everybody is always welcome to come to those meetings. So Susan asked me to speak tonight, and I said, well, a lot of you have already heard me speak, and I don't want to use the same talk. And so she said, well, talk about pollination, because everybody wants to know about pollinating their fruit trees and their rare fruit in their own backyards, and what's going on with that. So she said, make sure you get in there all the rare fruit stuff. And so I sat down at the computer and I started banging away at this, And I said, you know, I'm really not the plant guy, I'm the bee guy. And I'm going to be sitting in front of a lot of people that are plant people. And I better be careful because whatever I say, I could make a real fool of myself. And believe you me, I can make a fool of myself talking about bees, let alone talking about rare fruit. So, I'm going to touch on some fruit and pollination with honeybees, but this talk is going to be about honeybees and pollination. So we're going to actually do the birds and the bees for plants, and we're going to leave out a lot of the birds. But birds are actually pollinators also. So, let's begin. What is pollination? How many people in here know the answer to that question? Everybody should be raising their hand, yet we're not going to get into all the scientific stuff. Pollination is the process by which pollen is transferred from the anther, the male part, to the stigma, female part of the plant, thereby enabling fertilization and reproduction. Yes, we're going to talk about sex tonight. So, a lot of plants will bloom a flower, and that flower consists of both male and female parts. Yes, it's a very diverse world out there. And so, some of those plants are wind pollinated. Wind just blows some pollen from that same flower into that same flower, and next thing you know, it's pollinated and it's giving fruit, right? There are other plants out there where you actually have a male flower and a female flower, and you have to get the pollen from one plant to another plant. And that's where it can become a little tricky for the plant. Now, some plants will still do that by wind. So they counts on wind to be that pollinator for it, blow that pollen to another flower and hope it gets in the right spot, and then that flower will drop off and it will create a fruit. So that's the easy part, pollination. So pollination is not just done by bees. Believe it or not, bees aren't the only ones that pollinate. So we have birds, bats, butterflies, bees, beetles, wasps, flies, and wind are all geared to pollinate. Now, everybody thinks of the honeybee as the pollinator. Well, the honeybee isn't even native to the Americas. So yes, it's an invasive species. And when I do my talks, people always say, well, how did things get pollinated if there weren't honeybees here? And I say, well, we do have other things that do pollinate, and honeybees aren't the only bees in the world. There are over 20,000 different types of bees. There are 3,000 different types of bees right here in the state of Florida. But none of them are quite like the honeybee. The honeybee is a special little critter. And the honeybee was brought here by the first settlers. So the Spanish brought honeybees here. And they brought honeybees here because that was their source of sugar and mead, alcohol. The first alcoholic drink was made out of honey, mead. So it was a very important and useful thing to bring with them, the nectar of the gods. And so we're not going to really get into the bats and butterflies, the beetles, wasps, flies. I just want you to realize that there are other pollinators. Now, man has chosen the honeybee to be its slave or pollinator of choice. And this has happened more recently because of the style of farming that we're moving into. Industrialized farming. And high-density industrialized farming requires massive pollination. Because in the past we had a lot of little farms, and those little farms grew crops that could be pollinated by the natural pollinators in the area to produce, let's say, 1 bushel of fruit per acre. Now, those aren't the numbers, but let's just say it is. Keep it simple. Now, when we go to industrialized farming, they want to get 5 bushels off of that same acre. So they plant 5 times the amount of plants. And sure, the plants will grow. You know, we throw some synthetic fertilizer on there and force the water on them and do all these neat things, and we can get 5 times the plants. But the natural pollinators can't get to every one of those flowers to pollinate everything to give you 5 times the amount of crop. And so you still end up with 1 bushel, or maybe you increase the yield by 1 more, but you don't get 5 times the amount of pollination. So man has chosen the honeybee to become his pollinator, to truck in 5 times the amount of pollinators to those industrialized farms, to pollinate those plants to get that 5 times yield. So during pollination, it's a mutualistic relationship where both the plant and pollinators benefit. So the plant has to get something out of this. And the plant is getting reproduction out of it because it's recruiting something to do a job for it. Because the plant can't walk over to another plant and say, hey, you're looking pretty good tonight. Let's get together. So it needs to recruit a bee, a butterfly, a wasp, a bat, any one of those things to take the pollen to another flower or another plant. And so the plant is getting out of this reproduction. Now, what does the bee or the pollinator get out of it? Most of the time it's food. So nectar is a reward given to the bee for coming to the plant. Now the bee needs the nectar as its carbohydrate, but it also needs pollen as its protein source. And so the bee is getting 2 things out of it. It's protein and carbohydrate, but it will also deliver those goodies to the next set of plants. Some plants are very specific with respect to what animal is able to serve as the pollinator and have special modifications to attract that pollinator or exclude other would-be pollinators. So the structure of the flower is designed in a way to be specific to a specific pollinator. Because bees will go to anything that will give it sugar and water in the form of nectar or pollen to feed itself. So corn, everybody knows corn, right? Corn is a wind pollinator. And that big tassel at the top of the corn, that is pollen. And that pollen gets blown around and it pollinates and you get corn. Well, Monsanto genetically altered GMO corn, and they say, well, we're not harming the honeybee because bees don't pollinate corn. It's a wind pollinator. But if you take a human and stick them on a cruise ship and you say, don't go to the buffet, the first place they go is the buffet table, right? Well, if you have bees sitting right next to a cornfield, you know where they're going? To the buffet, because they eat pollen. They're not pollinating the corn, but they're going to steal that pollen. They will take anything. Bees will take anything that is dusty, thinking it's pollen. They will take it. They'll take sawdust. I'm working out in the garage cutting wood. My bees are coming and taking the sawdust back to their hive. That's not pollen, stupid. And that's one of the problems with insecticides. A lot of the powder insecticides, 7 dust, bees will collect it and take it back to the hive. Oh, it's got to be good. Looks like pollen, doesn't taste like pollen. And so, getting off track a little bit. All right, so special shape to the flower. The flower might be long and thin, and it's designed for a hummingbird, where the bee's tongue isn't long enough to stick its tongue all the way down in and get the nectar from it. So there's food in there waiting for a hummingbird. And other plants are specifically designed for honeybees. Color is a big distinction for the honeybee. Bees see in the ultraviolet spectrum. Okay? So they don't see like you and I see. They see like if we were looking in a black light. You know, the things that glow in black light are the things that the bees see. So red, bees see it as black. Bees see white, yellows, blues. And some people have told me, well, I've seen bees go to red flowers. Well, this is true. But what you can't see on that red flower is an ultraviolet dust that's usually in stripes that will lead the bee and point the direction to the nectar and the pollen. So the bee is following this stripe right down. So a lot of plants have striped flowers, and those stripes, if they're lighter in color, is usually to attract a honeybee or the bee family. So other plants are more general and more attractive to a wider variety of pollinators, but risk here is that pollen may not get to the right species if the pollinator visits a different type of flower next. All right, now this was a very interesting thing. How many people in here grow passion vine? Passion vine? Do you ever get passion fruit? Because you walk around with a feather, don't you? How many people walk around with a feather and that pollinate their own? Dennis, you do, right? Well, I hear so many people say, oh, it's so hard to get the passion vine to give fruit. Well, you know the purple one? Who has purple? Purple is pollinated by honeybees. Okay, they love the purple. And again, it goes back to that structure of the flower itself. And so if you get honeybees going to your passion, purple passion, you're going to get fruit. How many people have yellow passion vine? You don't want honeybees. Because honeybees, like I said, they will go and take just about anything. Well, they will take the pollen from the yellow passion fruit, but the plant gives the pollen first, and the female receptor of that flower is not developed enough to receive the pollen, and the honeybee actually takes the pollen to use it for food, doesn't pollinate the flower, then when the plant is ready to receive that pollen, there is no pollen there for it to pollinate the flower. And so this can be an issue. If you're growing yellow passion vine, your fingers are crossed to the honeybee because they love it and they'll go and take the nectar and the pollen, but you're not going to get fruit because they're stealing the pollen from that flower. So right here, the risk is that plant is offering these things to so many different varieties of pollinators, they're not specific, that they end up having problems bearing fruit.
I have a question.
Okay.
Because I did have a fruit in the passion fruit for 3 years.
Okay.
I purchased a long time ago. It was a Home Depot. And I was upset. And I said, I'm not having no fruit. And all of a sudden, I have all the bees coming out to my place. And I have buckets, 5-gallon buckets of the white, the yellow passion fruit. Buckets.
Buckets and buckets.
Yeah, but I have
You're lucky.
over there, and I had to share with all my neighbors because I have a lot.
There you go. I'm just telling you what the book says. You know, those. And you see bees on the yellow passion fruit?
Yeah.
All right, but they're not pollinating it.
I don't know, but I have fruit. You don't know?
They might be. If that flower is going into... Yeah, maybe if I read a different book, right? So, wouldn't that be clever? See, this is the problem that I said I could get into with the... See, I'm talking in front of the fruit people. Right? So, very specific to the flower, and those bees love nectar-producing flowers. Anybody know the firebush? It's that long tubular flower. Bees aren't designed to get that nectar from that flower, but they'll go to the bottom and chew a hole in the back of the flower so they can actually get their tongue in there to get the nectar. So they're a little bit of a scavenger, So a must for plants. Some supply reward frequently food for the pollinator. They advertise the presence of this food to attract visitors. They do that with the bright colors. The bright colors are attracting certain pollinators. And like I said, you might see a lot of striping, pointing the way for the honeybee to find the nectar and the pollen. Have a way of putting the pollen on the pollinator so it's transferred to the next plant or flower. And the reward is not always food or nectar. There's a tropical orchid with a flower that looks and smells like a female of a certain species of wasp. The male wasp smells the orchid thinking that it's a female going to mate with it. And it lands on that flower and then flies to the next flower thinking it's a female. And it delivers the pollen. And the plant ends up tricking the wasp into pollinating for it. So I've done the exact same thing, you know? But just not with orchids. So been tricked many a times. So what is nectar? Nectar is sugar and water, basically, given by the plant as a reward for coming to that plant. And that honeybee is totally reliant upon that nectar. Now, everybody knows that bees will go out and they will forage on a flower, they will collect nectar, and they lick it off the plant and they put it in a special stomach called the honey stomach or the crop. It's just like a bird. It's not their digestive stomach. It's like a crop. It's the first stomach. Mixes with some enzymes in there. Some of the water is absorbed into the crop to start taking the water content out of the nectar. And when their crop gets totally full, they head back to the hive. They regurgitate that nectar and feed it to another young bee. That young bee puts it inside its crop. It mixes with more enzymes. A little bit more water is absorbed out of that nectar because nectar is 80 to 90% water. And then that bee will regurgitate it into the honeycomb. And when it's in the honeycomb, the young bees will sit on that cell and fan it to evaporate the water from the nectar. And they sit there and evaporate the water until it's down to a 17% water content. And then it's actually honey. It's not honey until it gets down to 17% water content. If we harvest that nectar, which is an uncapped cell, it can ferment. There's too much water in there and yeast can grow in that water and ferment the honey. And so you end up with mead. And that's the first humans that were harvesting honey. They were actually harvesting honey and nectar. And when they'd put it in a container to save it, then they go back to it a couple weeks later and it's bubbling. They don't want to get rid of it. So they still ate it and found out that, whoo, I like this stuff. And it was alcohol. So honey, before it turns into honey, nectar will ferment and go bad. Honey, on the other hand, if it's at 17% water content, will never go bad. They actually found honey in Egyptian tombs that was over 3,000 years old, and it was still edible. Yep. So it's an incredible thing. And so pollen is the male cells produced by all flowering plants for fertilization. Pollen is collected to pollinate plants and is used by the honeybee as food. Now, most of it is protein. So their carbohydrate is coming from the nectar, and the protein is coming from the pollen. Pollen is 35% protein, 10% sugars, carbohydrates, enzymes, minerals, and vitamins A, B, etc., etc., etc. So, pollen, if anybody's looked at pollen underneath a microscope, you get this pollen that has little spikes on it. You get smooth pollen. You get pollen with dimples in it. But all pollen has a hard shell all the way around it to help protect it. And when bees collect that pollen, they can't digest that pollen right off the plant. So they actually have to pack it into the honeycomb, and they call it bee bread. They pack it into the honeycomb and mix nectar with it. So a little bit of nectar, a little bit of saliva from their mouth, and pollen, and it turns into bee bread. And why do we call it bee bread? Because of that yeast that can grow in the nectar. So they actually have yeasts doing their digestion for them. They want that to ferment, and the fermentation process, just like bread, creates an alcohol, but that fermentation process starts breaking down the shell around the pollen. And so when that shell gets broken down, then the bee can actually eat it and get the protein out of it. If they eat it before it's turned into bee bread, it will pass right through their body and they won't get any nutrients out of that pollen whatsoever. So they create bee bread out of the pollen to use as protein. And that bee bread is used to feed their young and feed them themselves. So pollen cannot be digested right off the flower for the honeybee. Foraging constancy. The efficiency of honeybees is due to their great numbers, their physique, and their behavior for foraging only on one plant species at a time. Now, let me explain that. Because when a bee comes out of the hive, she'll forage 3 to 5 miles to find nectar and pollen. Okay? When she goes to a plant, let's say a sunflower, all right, she's not going to go to an orange tree right after that. Because nature has designed it that it needs to pollinate. So it's going sunflower, 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 and then back to the hive, dump off the pollen and the nectar that it's collected, and then if it goes back out of the hive, it might go to that orange tree, or it might go to a cosmo, or it might go to, passion vine, might go to whatever. But then it's going to do the same flower, so pollination will occur. Now you might get 2 bees leaving the hive, one going to the sunflower and one going to the passion vine, but they're very specific on once they hit a flower, they're going to that same flower again until they dump that load. Now bees will go to whatever flower is the most plentiful. So I've had people say, I got 2 sunflowers growing in my garden and not one bee has touched them. Yep, because there's 10,000 Spanish needle growing in your yard also. And they'll go to the Spanish needle, Spanish needle, Spanish needle, Spanish needle, and then back to the hive. And so they never get to that sunflower because there's only 2 of them. And so if you're going to bring bees into your yard to help pollinate the things growing in your yard, make sure that you have enough things growing in your yard for the bees to go to it. If you have one avocado tree that stands this tall, it's probably not worth it for me to take a box of bees to your house. If you have one avocado tree that's been there for 10, 20 years, and this thing is huge, those bees will be all over that. There has to be enough flowers and food for the bees to make it worth their while to go there. I've gone to houses where they say, they're just not pollinating anything in my yard. Well, you got one of these, one of these, one of these, and one of these. Yep, they're going somewhere else because there's a lot in bloom around you. So, and they will travel 3 to 5 miles to find food. So, if you think that just by bringing bees into your yard, it's going to pollinate everything, think twice. Now, if you plant enough of everything, like Susan's yard, wow, what a yard, Susan. She has bees on everything because there's enough of everything to make it worth their while to stop at all the different varieties of plants.
They don't have to be next to each other.
They can be, 100 yards apart. They could be your neighbor's plants. They could be, a half mile away. They'll hit yours, then they'll fly a half mile away, or they'll hit yours on the way back,
Amazing if they know it's half a mile away.
Isn't that crazy? We're going to get into that too. So it's estimated that half of the pollinators of tropical plants, Rare Fruit Society, are bees. Now when I say bees, it's not only honeybees. There's 3,000 different types of bees that will pollinate half of the tropical plants here in Florida. So that's a staggering number, so the bees are helping. And another interesting fact, a lot of plants will still give fruit, but the increased yield comes from honeybee pollination. So you'll still get fruit without honeybees, but if you have honeybees, you're going to get increased yield production. Carambola. Bees love carambola, and those things are in bloom all the time, right? I've seen carambola trees where the limbs are breaking off, and, they ought to be moving their bees out a little bit further because the bees are just going crazy on it, pollinating everything on that. And, man, it's just falling apart. So, you can see, white flower, they're liking the white flowers. Busy as a bee. I don't know if we're going to get sound with this, but that's all right. Oh, we did. Isn't that crazy, huh? So, usually a honeybee can visit between 50 and 1,000 flowers in one trip. It takes between 30 minutes and 4 hours for a bee to forage to come back, depending on how far it's going to fly. So it might be going 5 miles away, foraging, spending time, and have to fly back, and it's going to take up to 4 hours sometimes. A bee can make between 7 and 14 trips a day. Now this is a staggering number right here. A colony with 25,000 forager bees, each making 10 trips a day, is able to pollinate 250 million flowers. Now, keep in mind that it takes 1 million flowers for a honeybee to make 1 pound of honey. 1 million flowers. 288 bees to make that 1 pound of honey. Right? 12 bees their entire life to make 1 teaspoon of honey. If you add up all the miles that the 288 bees had to fly to make that 1 pound of honey, 1 bee could have flown around the earth not once, but twice. 54,000 miles to make 1 pound of honey. Next time you eat honey, you're going to appreciate a little bit more. So this 25,000 forager bees pollinating 250 million flowers is the reason why man has chosen the honeybee to be its slave. It's a perfect little box because we can have 25,000 bees in just 1 box of a beehive. One box can carry 25,000 bees in it, right? And all those bees are coming back to that box at nighttime, and we can move that box at night to another field. They wake up in the morning, they say, woohoo, new buffet. And they go out, and they come back to that box. Then we can move it to the next field. How convenient is that? Do you ever think about trying to find 25,000 butterflies, catch them all, put them in a truck, take them to California, open the doors, and say, pollinate the almonds. And they all fly away. And when you want to take them to Washington to do apples, you got to go collect butterflies again. Very inconvenient. Bees, on the other hand, they're in this nice little wooden box. They always come back to the box. There's a lot of them, 25,000 in one box, right? Well, that one box of bees can do 250 million flowers. Crazy, isn't it? That's why the honeybee is the pollinator of choice. All right, next one. Bees and pollination. Bees don't see red, we already said that, but do see blue, yellow, and ultraviolet. Thus, bees pollinate flowers that are mostly yellow, some blue, whites. Flowers have ultraviolet nectar guides or landing patterns to guide the bees to the nectar and pollen. The flowers typically have a delicate, sweet scent, which the bees can smell. Bees they can smell 1 part per trillion. Excellent sense of smell. How many people have heard that bees were used as bomb sniffers?
They were trying to.
It is true.
They were using bees for bomb sniffers.
They weren't actually taking them out in the field. They wanted to see and prove a point that you can train a bee to smell for bombs, and it's 5 times greater than a dog, the sense of smell. And so what they do is they actually band a bee to a tongue depressor, and they feed it sugar water, which has no flavor or smell to it. And every time they'd feed that bee sugar water on that stick, they would have a pile of gunpowder sitting there. And so every time the bee would recognize food and gunpowder, the smell of gunpowder, it would think, I'm getting fed. And it would stick out its tongue. And so it was real quick, a day to a day and a half, and they could take this bee and start using it to sniff things. And if they saw the tongue come out next to a suitcase, they knew there was gunpowder inside the suitcase. Crazy, because it was thinking that there was food on that suitcase. Smell, usually the nectar is at the end of some of the small, narrow floral tubes, which is the right length to fit the tongue of the particular species of the bee that pollinates that plant. And I was discussing that about the firebush, where bees are clever little things, and they will chew the backside to get around that little deficiency. The magic. Bees are magic. I'd love to come back and talk about yoga moments with bees, right? Susan, yoga moments? I'll work bees without a veil, gloves, shorts, t-shirt, flip-flops. I'm in my yoga moment. If you're there right with the bees, meditating with the bees, they're good with you and you're good with them, it's all good. But the magic, this is crazy. Everybody thinks that bees collect pollen, right? The pollen collects the bee because the plant can't totally depend on the bee because the bee wants to eat that pollen. I'm not giving it back to that next flower. I'm going to eat it. So what happens is a honeybee is covered with hair. If you ever look at a honeybee close up, they're hairy little things. When they fly through the air, the friction on the hairs of that honeybee flying through the air creates a static charge to those hairs. Just like if a kid was to take a balloon and rub it on their head, that friction against the hair and the balloon will create a static charge, and that balloon will stick to you because of the static electricity. So the bee, when it's flying to the flower, becomes positively charged, a positive static charge on the bee. Well, the flowers are grounded. Imagine that. They're growing in the ground, so they're grounded. So when bees land on the flower, the static electricity is actually attracting the negative pollen and the positive static on the bee. So pollen will actually jump onto the bee without the bee even thinking about it. Yep. And so those hairs collect all the pollen. And then when the bee goes to the next flower, some of that pollen will fall off. Just because of the bee walking around in the flower, that pollen falls off, pollination happens, flower will drop off, it'll bear fruit, success. Everybody's happy. Now the bee is sitting there saying, what's all this stuff all over me? And it starts grooming the hairs on its body. It'll take the pollen in its front paws, hands, I don't even know what they call. They don't have fingers. And they'll spit on it. And in flight, they'll take flight and put their hands back and put the pollen as little snowballs on their back legs. So this has already groomed itself and has placed the pollen on the back legs. A lot of people think that the bees walk around on the flower and it creates that snowball on the back. Doesn't happen like that. Goes all over the bee. They actually create the snowball. Now when they're spitting on it to get it all to stick together, they're putting enzymes with the pollen. So when they put it inside the honeycomb, now it starts to ferment and break down that shell. So that's where the enzymes are coming to start that fermentation process. And so digestion in the honeybee actually starts in the honeycomb. We learned that before. So now remember that. So everybody understands the static electric charge, the jumping on because positive and negatives, because this next slide is incredible. And not many people know this. Because when a bee goes to a flower, it takes the nectar and pollen, right? What happens to the next bee coming by? It says, darn, somebody was already here. Goes to the next flower. Darn, somebody was already here. Next thing you know, that thing's out there for 5 hours saying, I haven't found one flower with pollen or nectar on it. It's crazy, isn't it? Bees are so efficient. That's what makes them such good pollinators, because of this next slide. You're dying to know, aren't you? Yeah? Do I got you? All right. It's because of this. Incredible, isn't it? The flower is electrically charged. And when the bee lands on that flower, it takes the charge and neutralizes it. Because the positive and negative, it's like you walking around shuffling your feet. Walking up to your buddy, zap! Ah, gotcha. Right? And now neither one of us are charged. I got to rub my feet again. Right? Well, the plant is no longer electrically charged. And so the bees can sense that electric charge before they even land on that flower. So the bees don't even go to the flower because they know that somebody's already been there and took the nectar and pollen. That's what makes them so efficient. They can cruise around and know, oh, that's an empty one, oh, there's a full one. And they head for that electric charge. And zap, they get it. That's crazy, isn't it? Bees change the charge of whatever flower they land upon. This changing field can tell a bee whether a flower has been recently visited and might be some sort of, or might be short of nectar. It's like a sign saying closed for business. Now the length of time that it takes to recharge that flower is recharging the nectar. And so it'll recharge itself and then make itself available for the next bee, saying, hey, come back to me. I'm ready to be pollinated again. Because how many people have a plant in here that needs to be visited by a pollinator more than once to actually set fruit? Pears, 4 times. So they have to reset and get another pollinator there. It's not done. Their job isn't done. So a lot of plants, not only once, some twice, 3 times, 4 times. It's crazy. So they have to make that available. And now, it's mind-blowing stuff. You would have never thought of all this stuff. Some flowers are open with nectar all day and night, while others are open only for a few hours in the morning or the afternoon or night. Anybody have night blooming plants? And man, are they fragrant, right? You could smell them a half mile away. What's pollinating them? Moths. Usually moths. And so bees aren't pollinating it because bees don't fly at night, right? But did you know that some flowers will only give nectar in the morning, some will give it in the afternoon, and some will give it in the evening to attract different pollinators? And so maybe that female receptor isn't available during the hottest part of the day, where pollen transfer can only happen in the morning. So they want to attract the pollinator first thing in the morning. So that's when they're the most fragrant, and that's when they give the most nectar. And bees actually learn what flowers give nectar at what time of the day. Bees can remember 7 different flowers and 7 different times of the day to go to that flower. 9 a.m., I got to go over to this one. 10 a.m., got to go over this one. It's crazy. So a worker bee learns and remembers what time the different flowers are worth visiting. One bee can remember the opening time for up to 7 different types of flowers.
How long does it take them to learn?
Not very long.
Because you move from state to state.
Not very long. I'll set out food for my bees in the yard. I can set that food there at a particular time in the morning, and then in an hour or so, it's all gone because my bees have just devoured it all. You go back there in 2 hours, no bees. You go there tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., all these bees are flying around saying, hey, isn't this when the buffet comes out? So they learn it with a very short period of time. One day is, I know for a fact, because my bees will be looking for that food tomorrow morning at the same time that I put the food out there the morning before. My daughter did a science fair project, and she set out food in the yard, and when a bee would come to the dish of food, she would put a little color of paint on it. And she was trying to figure out how long it took them to when they left the food before that bee came back to the food. And it was quick. The hives were pretty close. But it was anywhere from 20 seconds to a minute and a half that it took them to unload and come back. But then she started realizing that the next day, when she set up the experiment again, that the bees were already waiting at the station for her because they were the ones with the dots. So she knew it was the same bees coming back. She went to states, but didn't get state. She didn't win states. She did regional, though. So it was a great presentation for her. She was scared poopless. We have little ones in here, so I'm going to keep it clean. 7 different types of flowers. Up. Up. All right, here we go. And then the ability of the honeybee to communicate to other bees in the colony where to go for collecting more pollen and nectar is very important. When a scout bee has found a good nectar or pollen source, she will return to the colony and communicate to other bees where they can find the same food. This is done with a special dance indicating the distance, quality, and direction from the nest. Again, this is what makes bees such good pollinators, because they're the ones communicating where the good food sources are to the other bees. Butterflies don't go around saying, "Woohoo, I found milkweed over here." Anybody? Anybody? Because they're flying around by themselves. So they're not telling anybody, "There's milkweed over here." Bees, they're going back to the hive and telling 25,000 other bees, "Hey, this is what I found. It's really good, and this is where it's at." Totally mind-blowing of how they do it. It's called the waggle dance. I will. Not me personally, but on the screen. It's 3 slides long. So we're going to talk about this for a little bit, because I could do a whole presentation just on this dance, but we're going to keep it short and sweet. All right? So may I have this dance? So the waggle dance, everybody I think has heard about the waggle dance. It's not Mr. Wiggles. If any of you have kids, Mr. Wiggles was this guy from Australia that would sing and dance for little kids. All right. So are you guys still awake? Yeah. All right, you're good? I'm not yelling at you? All right, good. I am? Sorry. I get excited about this stuff. I get excited. So the waggle dance. It literally is the waggling of the bee to tell the other bees where the food is, how far away from the hive, and what direction to fly to find it. And so if the bee is waggling and going in a circle and waggling the whole time, that means within 100 yards of the hive, there's this food source. And it will give it regurgitation of the nectar, saying, "This is what you're looking for. This is the flavor and the smell that you're looking for." And pollen to say, "Here we go." And within 100 yards of the hive is this food source. So when I put food in my yard close to my bees, my whole yard is crisscrossing bees. And they'll be flying patterns around my yard until they narrow down that food that I left for them. And then they zoom in on it, and next thing you know, it's a straight line back and forth to that food. But they'll be all over the yard trying to figure out within 100 yards, here's the food, and find it. So it's not quite as precise as the figure 8 waggle dance. Now, the figure 8 waggle dance is a figure 8. Okay? And the bee won't waggle during these outer strokes. It only waggles on the center stroke of that 8. Now, if the 8, the waggle is going this way, the direction is this way. If they waggle on the 8 going this way, hey, you go out of the hive and make a, to me it's right, to you it's going to be left, right? Is that backwards? So the direction of the waggle, so these bees are saying, hey, you're going that way. Now, if this was the other way, it would be that direction. Now, it's always centered to the frame. There's a frame of honeycomb that's in the hive straight up and down. So gravity is telling them that this is the center line, and everything is an angle off of that center line. So there's degrees from the center line. So it can be 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, 40 degrees, 50 degrees, so on, so on, so on. So this figure 8 is going to give the angle of gravity straight up and down and the angle this way. And the length or the time of that waggle is the distance away from the hive that the bees are going to fly. So you're going to fly 20 degrees right, and you're going to fly for a half mile, and you're going to find this. Pretty good, huh? That's crazy. Crazy stuff. Now, if you watch real close, you're going to see the waggle dance. Don't watch me, because I'm not going to be up here waggling. It's going to happen up there.
Oh, it looks a bit like a figure eight. And they waggle their abdomen, and they, through the center part of this dance, it's really called the waggle dance. And they can communicate exact distance and direction. They can communicate.
Yeah, whatever. See? I got her to shut up. But did you notice the bee coming back had pollen balls, right? That's the one that just came back. Did you notice the other bees going up to that bee and smelling the bee? Because that bee smells like what they're looking for. And then
Oh, it looks a bit like a figure eight. And
all these bees are going up and now feeding the bee,
dance is really called the waggle dance.
smelling the bee.
They can communicate exact distance,
See, licking the pollen.
direction. They can communicate.
Everybody see that? They're gathering information. This is important information. Fly left, right. I don't know left, right. Front, back, forwards. Then you're not ready to fly yet. Math, it's very important. Go to algebra. Yes, ma'am.
It's amazing, and it's way beyond my math skills. If it's trigonometry, it takes into account where the sun is in the shadow. And when they're giving them directions, it's when they get to there, where will be the angle of the sun.
Yeah, because that
Mathematics,
darn sun moves,
they take it into account, and it's in their dance.
right? That sun moves. So let's say the bee gets to the flowers, spends 2 hours there collecting nectar and pollen, and then says, wait a minute, I'm going over there. No, you should be over here. The sun moved to change that angle on you. So the bees actually recognize the length of time they're away, how far the sun has changed in the amount of time that they've been away, and they recalculate to get them back to within 2 feet of their hive. And then it gets visual and smell. 2 feet. 5 miles away. How many people drunk, if I dropped them off in a strange place, could get back within 2 feet of where they're supposed to be? Not me. All right. Man's pollination slave. Honeybees and the man have traveled a long and perilous journey from their tentative first flights in colonial America, because they weren't native, to the intensely managed, politically volatile pollination fields of modern industrialized farms. Now, we touched on this a little bit, and I don't know that almonds are a rare fruit, but almonds are the real good example, because man has really manipulated this crop to pound down the point. So if you've ever been to California and you went to see the almonds in bloom, it's a beautiful sight. A sea of flowers. Look. Oh, sea of flowers, right? Well, if you look up close, there's almond trees and there's dirt, a little bit of grass. They spray Roundup on everything to keep the weeds down, because they don't want to have to mow it. It costs money, right? So for the size of the state of Delaware, you have nothing but almond trees, right? Well, that's all great and good, but pollinators can't live there except for one time during the year, when those almond trees are in bloom. And they only bloom for 6 weeks. And so pollinators will starve to death because honeybees, they only forage 3 to 5 miles, right? Well, the size of Delaware is a little bit more than 3 to 5 miles. So there's no food whatsoever for the honeybee in the middle of that almond orchard. So all the pollinators have moved out of that area. Even the natural pollinators have moved out because there's no food there. And by the time the plants go into bloom, there's no time for the pollinators to get from here all the way to the center to pollinate everything before the bloom has stopped blooming. And so almonds are 95% pollinated strictly by man bringing honeybees into the orchards to pollinate those crops. Then the beekeeper has to remove those bees right after the bloom is done so they don't starve to death. So this is what industrialized farming has done for us. It's created a lot of work. Well, the same thing has happened in Japan or China. Japan, with the pear trees, where the pollinators have died off, and now the people come out of the villages during the bloom with feathers to pollinate their pear trees. Crazy, huh? I'm not going there. I'm not sure. I don't think. They're up in the trees. You see pictures of them up in the trees. Oh, a partridge in a pear tree. Uh-huh. All right. So hives wanted. In a mature orchard, there should be a minimum of 1 hive per acre, 2 hives per acre in pairs, and pollen transfer is seldomly done by wind in most orchards. So 1 beehive in your backyard is probably sufficient to pollinate because you're not even solid planting for 1 or 2 acres. So 1 or 2 beehives, and that'll be a 3-mile radius. It's going to serve for pollination in that whole area. So you could be the one being the pollinator for your entire neighborhood. Backyard plantings probably have enough wild bees to do the job. Things will set most of the time without having to bring honeybees into your backyard because it gets back to that fact that natural pollinators can get to all those flowers before that plant is done blooming. Now, where the problem comes in is all the insecticides that we're using. We're having a lot of trouble with our natural pollinators dying off right along with honeybees. And the day will come where those trees aren't getting pollinated because there's no pollinators because of insecticides or problems that man's created where we're not getting pollination. Now, if you have beehives in your backyard, you will get an increased yield of fruit on your plants. So you'll still get fruit, but you're going to get more fruit if you have bees in your backyard. So it's to increase the amount of yield. It's not really to set the fruit itself. How many people in here know that oranges really don't need honeybee pollination? 1, 2. Most oranges, you think of oranges, oh, this is a crop that, beekeepers go to all the time. They got to pollinate all those orange groves. Some orange grove growers don't want beekeepers anywhere near their groves because their trees will get seeds in the fruit if it's pollinated by the honeybee. Okay? So the tree will still give fruit if it's not pollinated by the honeybee, and it'll be seedless. So they can get top dollar for that seedless orange, but if that darn honeybee comes to it, darn, got seeds in it. Next thing you know, in the orange groves, it's the beekeeper that wants to be there because he's going there for the nectar from the orange blossom honey. So if I take my hives to an orange grove just before it goes into bloom, those bees are going to forage on just orange blossoms because the most widely available flower is the orange blossom. They're going to go there, and that's how I can call it orange blossom honey. But I have to harvest that honey either before that bloom is over or just after that bloom is over, because as soon as those blooms drop off the trees, the bees will then start going to the Spanish needle, the other things, and mixing other nectar in with it, and then I'd have to call it wildflower. So how do they get orange blossom honey? How do they get avocado honey? How do they get buckwheat honey? How do they get all these different honeys? It's by dropping their bees just when it goes into bloom, harvesting the honey right after the bloom, and calling it that specific plant, because bees are specific to that plant when it's in mass like that. And every honey will taste a little bit different. So there's light-colored honeys, dark-colored honey. It's because of the minerals inside the nectar that's creating different flavors and different colors to the honey itself. So that's the end of my presentation. How perfect was that, Susan? And I thank you for listening to me or letting me yell at you. And again, it's Palm Beach County Beekeepers Association. And please be understanding and understand bees. And that's my organization. Yes, sir?
How long does it take from when a honeybee deposits the nectar into the hive so you can get honey out of it to eat?
About that long. Yep, and I say that because if I have bees in my backyard, okay, it's all dependent on how many flowers are in bloom at that particular moment. If there's a lot in bloom, they're going to make honey really quick because they don't have to fly as far and they don't have to search as much. So they can do quick trips back and forth. So in an orange grove, in that 6-week period of time that those bees are in bloom, one box of bees can make 75 to 100 pounds of honey in 6 weeks. Because they're short trips, you know, and it's the buffet. Now in my backyard, bees are having to fly further, and they're foraging on this flower here, then they're flying, you know, a little bit further. It's taking longer. So I might only get 100 pounds of honey out of that hive a year if I'm lucky. Okay, most of the time it's 25 to 50 pounds in a year. But you give them the ability. Give you an example. I have a 55-gallon drum that I can put sugar water in, okay? I have 40 beehives, 20,000 bees roughly per hive, okay? Those 40 beehives can drink that 55-gallon drum of sugar water in 6 hours. Gone. A drop at a time. Gone. Just voracious. And other times, they're out collecting food. They'll leave the drum sitting there because they like what they're getting somewhere else. In January, February, oh man, they'll pound that stuff down quick. So they can transfer a lot quick because the distance between my hive and the feeder is very close. All right, so it's all relative to how much food.
What's the life expectancy of the bee?
6 to 8 weeks of a worker bee. And it's not dying from old age. It's dying from flying so much that it wears away its wings. And when it can't fly anymore, it doesn't want to be a burden to the hive. And it'll walk away and die. Just to sacrifice so they don't have to feed an invalid bee. Okay? And now think of this. I've seen people when they start beekeeping, there'll always be bees walking around the yard. And they'll go and they'll pick up the bee and they'll take it over and set it on the hive. Oh, you're lost. Here you go. You know, I just saved a bee. I feel so good. That bee was sick and dying, and they just spread disease back into their own hive. You know? And it's like, no, they're walking away for a reason. Leave them be. You know? Up to 2,000 bees a day could be dying out of that hive. You know, so you got 2,000 bees walking out of that hive every day. You know? Don't pick them up. They're leaving for a reason.
How much does it cost to rent hives?
Rent hives. Oh, that's a great question. Depends on what crop and what time of year and how desperate you are. Okay? Almonds, when I first started in the beekeeping world, I could take one box of bees for 6 to 8 weeks out to California, and they'd give me $50 for that 6-week period of time for one box of bees for pollination services. Then I get the honey and the bees back, you know, so I don't give them the stuff. And just 6 years later, because of the decline in beekeepers and bees, the demand has gone up. They don't actually have enough bees to pollinate all the almonds in California anymore. So now it's between $200 and $250 for that same hive for a 6-week period of time. So now if you're a beekeeper with 1,000 hives and you get $250 a hive, that's $250,000, people, for a 6-week period of time. Ka-ching, ka-ching, let's become a beekeeper. How do you transport them? You put them in your pocket. You put them on a flatbed truck. 460 hives per truck. And they go to California. And it stresses them out. Yeah, you lose some bees along the way, you know, but if you have a good truck driver, they know how to water them and keep them comfortable. And, you know, most of them arrive there. So, and the funny thing is, like I said, there's running short in California, right? They've actually been flying bees in from New Zealand to pollinate almonds in California. So there's a trip for you, huh? Bees coming in from New Zealand by plane.
Do you have a lot of regulation when you go into a state?
You have to get your bees inspected in the state of Florida and get a certificate before they leave the state of Florida. That certificate gets you through all the states that you're just traveling through. But when then you get to California, they do their own inspection. And the biggest thing they're looking for? Fire ants. You could have 6 fire ants on one tractor trailer, and they won't let it in because of 6 fire ants. Now, they already have fire ants. They just don't want our fire ants. They sit there and say, we don't have them, you know, but they're there. And so that's the hardest thing is fire ants and getting the bees in. Then the bees actually have to go to a special station. They pressure clean everything and then try to get back in. But remember, most beekeepers keep 4 hives on a pallet, and that pallet sits right on the ground. Do you ever have a piece of wood, plywood, sitting on the ground in Florida? What ends up building a nest under there within a week? Fire ants, right? So it's a big problem, fire ants and trucking bees out to California.
Can you make a ploy about our poor bees and the systemics that people are using for their plants and for trees?
Systemics. Can we talk?
You got 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Systemics. Neonicotinoid pesticides. It's not good for bees. They're killing bees. They don't want to admit they're killing bees because there's no dead bees to show them. And they say, show me a dead bee, right? Well, what happens is before, we knew a pesticide kill-off because they would get into the pesticides, they'd bring it back to the hive, you have 2 inches of dead bees on the bottom of your hive and out front of the beehive. Pesticide kill-off. Easy to see. Neonicotinoids, right? Neonicotinoids are systemic pesticides that they either put on the seed or you can spray it on the plant and it goes into the plant or it gets drenched in through the roots. And that neonicotinoid is a nicotine, man-made nicotine that's inside the plant, and it's in the nectar and pollen of that plant. Now, it kills insects. The insects go and chew on the leaves, and the insect dies, right? So I was talking to the environmentalist from Home Depot, and I said, hey, don't carry plants with neonicotinoids in them, or at least put labels on them and tell us that there's neonicotinoids in there, you know, blah, blah, blah. He's like, prove to me that the bees are dying from neonicotinoids. There's no bees. There's no dead bees. It's because bees go there, they drink the nectar, and they get dementia almost instantly, and they can't find their way back to the hive. So that waggle dance, it's out the window. Their mathematics get screwed up. And that bee dies somewhere out there just flying around, so there's never a pile of dead bees. Right? So how many people have injected palm trees with systemic pesticides to kill whitefly? Nobody's going to admit it now, right? But that injection of neonicotinoids into the coconut trees, I know you have to do it to save your tree. And do it to save your tree. But then be responsible, and before that spike goes into bloom, cut it off for the next 2 years. Never let it go into bloom. Because it's going to have neonicotinoid pesticides in the nectar. And did you ever see one of those blooms? Covered in bees. It's a high nectar producing plant and bees just love it. You're killing bees left and right with the neonicotinoid pesticide. So back to that story about Home Depot. They were selling plants that they were calling pollinator friendly and create a pollinator garden, butterfly garden, this and that. Well, Friends of Earth took some of the plants and tested them. They all had neonicotinoid pesticides in them. So they weren't really safe for pollinators. So they were killing pollinators. And so we started interacting with Home Depot and we said, look, label it. Tell us and we won't buy the stuff, News tonight, Home Depot is actually enacting a program to start labeling their plants. So that's a positive. Within the next 3 years, Home Depot intends to phase out neonicotinoids from their growers and in their plants. They'll still have it on their shelves if it's allowed, but they'll say that you have to add it yourself if you want to add it. So they want their growers to get away from it. So the pressure was on, so it works. We can make a difference. Thank you very much. Have a great evening.